So it's time for the beginning of a book review. Her Cowboy Dilemma by the USA Today bestseller author C.J. Carmichael. Okay, now I'm going to read the back to you as always, and then we'll start in on the paper clips. Going home shouldn't be this hard. Cassidy Lambert traded in Montana's big sky country for the big city lights of forever, until a potentially devastating equine illness threatens her family's ranch, and Cassidy is needed at home to help. She thinks she knows what she wants from life, but more she's around the sexy veterinarian Dan Farley, the more confused she gets. When Cassidy comes back to the open western landscape Dan loves, she's nothing but a beautiful burr under his saddle. She stomped on his heart once before, and he's not eager for another go-round. But he just can't keep himself away from those green eyes and sweet curves. It's a good thing she'll soon be gone again, because he can't trust her or himself when she's ever around. Okay, so a little bit about the author first. Hard to imagine a more glamorous life than an accountant, isn't it? Still, C.J. Carmichael gave up the thrills of income tax forms and double-entry bookkeeping when she sold her first book in 1998. Now she's written more than 35 novels for the Harlequin, and invites you to learn more about her books, see photos of her hiking exploits and other her surprise contests at cjcarmichael.com. Originally this first published in 2013, this edition published in 2020, and was copyrighted in 2013. And she says this book is for her Aunt Eleanor Schwartz, who only this summer reminded me that she was the one who introduced me to Harlequin romances. Thank you for sharing your books. Here's one for you. This has a prologue before we start the story, so I decided that's where we're going to start. It was strange to think of Brock getting married today. He was the youngest of her brothers, and Cassidy Lambert would have asserted the least serious and least responsible of the bunch. Yet falling in love with Winnie Hayes had changed him in good ways. And at 28, he certainly wasn't too young for marriage. Not that his brothers had set a good example on that score. BJ at 34 and Corb at 32 were both still single. Could it be they talked Brock out of taking the plunge, or maybe he'd come up with cold feet all on his own? How else to explain the fact that Brock, who was supposed to be the groom, and Corb, who was supposed to be the best man, and their driver, friend, and foster brother, Jackson Stone, were 15 minutes late for the ceremony? Everything else was in place. Guests filled the pews of the Coffee Creek's pretty white church. The organist was doing her best to drive them crazy with important-sounding music. And the bride and bridesmaid, Cassidy included, were waiting in the antechamber for their big moment. What time did Corb say they left? Winnie asked. She was perched on the ledge of the window-sill with Cassidy, both of them peering out in a warm, sunny July afternoon. With her dark hair, creamy skin, and lovely figure, Winnie made the perfectly gorgeous bride. She was also fun and a good cook, strong enough to set Brock straight when he needed a firm hand. Cassidy approved. She also liked Winnie's friend from New York, Laurel Sheridan, who was checking her watch for the umpteenth time. 35 minutes ago, Laurel replied. What's happened? Winnie stared out the windows as if she could will the Coffee Creek Ranch black SUV to suddenly appear. Don't worry, Laurel said. Could be they ran out of gas or had a flat. Or maybe they got halfway here only to realize that Corb forgot the ring. Cassidy made the joke half-heartedly. She was actually starting to worry. Something both Corb and Brock would tease her about if she admitted later. She swung her new cream-colored cowboy boots, admiring how they went with the sage green dress that Winnie picked out for her and Laurel. She and Laurel were dressed like twins, except Laurel was wearing pretty high-heeled pumps with her dress. Cassidy didn't do pumps. Cowboy boots and running shoes were more her style. But if they had been held up, Winnie said, why haven't they called? Laurel held out her hands to Winnie. You're making me dizzy up there. Winnie jumped, and then Cassidy followed. I'll call them, she said, unable to stand the waiting anymore. I'll go get my phone. She slipped out of the antechamber, intending to head for the minister's office at the other end of the hall. All three of them had their purses, including their phones, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. But a late arriving guest caught her eye. Dan Farley, that local vet. was as darkly handsome as ever, and in a distraction of seeing him unexpectedly like this made her momentarily clumsy. As she tripped over her own feet, Dan gave her a quick, dismissive glance, not quick enough, however, to miss the approval in his expressive dark eyes. Or was it dislike? Probably both, Cassidy decided as she continued down the hall, trying not to think about the broad-shouldered vet or the beautiful woman who'd been standing by his side. Who was that woman? Her brothers hadn't mentioned anything about Farley having a new girlfriend. She entered the minister's office, went into the filing cabinet at the back, and pulled open the drawer. Then again, why would they tell her? No one had any reason to assume that she'd be interested in Dan Farley's love life, nor was she, not particularly. She grabbed her phone and called up Brock's number as she waited for him to answer. She made her way back to the antechamber. As she slipped inside the door, she heard Winnie whisper something to Laurel, but she stopped talking as soon as she saw Cassidy. Brock isn't answering, Cassidy ended the call, frustrated. I'll try Corb. No answer there, either. Damn. Finally, she called Jackson again. Nothing. If this is some sort of prank, I'm going to kill them. Actually, if she saw them right now, she'd be more inclined to give them all hugs. She was really worried, and someone's coming. Winnie in the back of the window. I think it's Jackson's SUV. Cassidy hurried to Winnie's side. Please let her be right. But one glance dashed all their hopes. No, it was the county sheriff's vehicle. She looked at Laurel, then Winnie, seeing it in their eyes, the same fear that was making minced meat of her stomach. They watched in suspended dread as the local sheriff made their way to the vehicle toward the church. Who is that? Laurel asked. Sheriff Savannah Moody, Winnie answered. She's a good friend of Brock's. We were going to invite her to the wedding, but he said there was bad blood between her and BJ. I don't know the details. Neither did Cassidy. One of the drawbacks of being the youngest in the family was that no one told you anything. Still, she knew there was trouble back a long time ago, to the last year BJ lived at home. Cassidy rushed out of the antechamber in time to see Savannah make her grand entrance. The crowd, expecting to see a bride, was quelled at the unexpected sight of the sheriff. Aware of Winnie and Laurel coming up behind her, Cassidy made a room for all three of them to follow in Savannah's wake. I need to talk to someone from the Lambert family. Savannah's official-sounding voice lifted and carried through the silent church. BJ stood first. Savannah, what happened? Olive Lambert rose next, clenching her son's arm. What's wrong? I'm sorry, Olive. There's been an accident. Jackson's SUV hit a moose on Big Valley Road, about 5 miles from town. A collective gasp by the congregation was followed by a few seconds of stunned silence. Cassidy flashed back to the days when her and her father had been teaching always to drive. Always drive slower at dusk. That's when your chances of hitting wildlife are the greatest, and pray that you never hit a moose. Cassidy, they're lethal. Brock, Winnie whispered. Savannah rotated slowly, not realizing the bridal party was standing at the rear. I'm so sorry, Winnie. Brock was in the front passenger seat. The impact point with a moose. He didn't have a chance. Cassidy felt as if she'd been kicked in the solar plexus. She was doubling over just when she heard BJ ask, what about Corb? And Jackson. Jackson was driving, wearing his seatbelt, and the airbag was able to cushion him from the worst of it. He's badly bruised and shaken, but he's okay. Your other brother was in the back seat. He should have been fine, but I'm afraid he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. As we speak, he's being med-activated to Great Falls. I can't say how bad his injuries are. You'll have to talk to the doctors about that. Is he conscious? Desperately, Cassidy prayed for Savannah to say yes, but the sheriff shook her head. No. Brock dead, and maybe Corb too? No, no, no. Cassidy wanted to run screaming from the church, but Laurel tugged on her arm, gesturing to Winnie. The bride was tottering on her heels, shaking violently. Cassidy reached out for her, and between them and she and Laurel managed to keep her from crashing to the floor. We need a sweater or a warm jacket, Laurel called out to the crowd. A second later, a man's suit jacket was settled over Winnie's shoulder, and a white cotton handkerchief was pressed into Cassidy's palm. She glanced up to see Dan Farley ordering the crowd to step back and give Winnie some space as he swooped the bride into his arms and carried her out into fresh air. Cassidy stood back to let them pass, her hand fisted over the handkerchief. Farley must have given this to her, only did she realize that tears were cascading down her face. That was page 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. 10 months later is where it picks back up at. Page 20. Cassidy, you're home. Laurel stopped to scoop up her 10-month-old daughter from the playpen. Look who's here, Steph. It's your Aunt Cassidy. Cassidy was already holding out her arms for the bundle. I hope she isn't making shy yet. Oh, she's too young for that. Besides, she's just getting used to new faces. We just got back to work last week. I swear out of business has tripled. It seems like everyone in the area is finding an excuse to drop in for a coffee and to say hello to the newest Lambert. Cassidy listened to all of this with a smile, and at the same time noticing how happy her sister-in-law appeared. Pretty, too, with her long red hair pulled back into a ponytail, but it seemed thicker and glossier than ever, and her fair skin was literally glowing. Page 21. Laurel deposited a kiss on Cassidy's cheek as she handed over her daughter, who had gained several pounds since Cassidy had seen her last. Oh, you look so cute. Look at she has Corb's dimple. I know, isn't it adorable? And only on the left cheek, just like her dad. Cassidy sighed as Stephanie cuddled in, soaking up the smooches her aunt couldn't resist planting on her downy, soft head. Her wispy hair was coming in orange and curly. How you doing, precious? Do you like working with your mommy in the cafe? The baby looked up and at the sound of Cassidy's voice, and Cassidy was amused to see that she had Lambert green eyes as well. Stephanie was staring at her intently, and only then, as she raised her little hand awkwardly reaching up, did Cassidy realize she was entranced by the sunglasses that were still resting on her head. She just started noticing her hands a few weeks ago, Laurel commented. Sometimes she stares at them for a minute at a time. It's so cute, but here I am talking endlessly about my wonderful baby again. Laurel rolled her eyes. What's new with you? How were your final exams? They went well, I think. I won't have my marks for a few weeks. Can I get you a coffee or a cinnamon bun for the road? Hearing the door open behind her, Cassidy moved out of the way so the newcomer could enter. You read my mind, thanks. Make that a double order, Winnie said, a deep voice behind her, and leave some space for coffee or cream in the coffee. Cassidy knew that voice. Slowly she turned, holding Stephanie like a shield between her and the tall, broad-shouldered man who just entered the cafe. Sure enough, there stood Diane Farley. That local vet had some Native American blood, which accounted for her high cheekbones, jet black hair, and almond-shaped eyes. Though he spoken to Winnie, it was like Cassidy he was looking at with that cool dislike. Hey, Farley. Darn her voice for coming out so soft and weak. She lifted her chin. How are things? Busy. He knew when she'd been going to college in Bozeman, and must have noticed the suitcases and boxes in the back of her truck. But he didn't ask her about her studies or show any interest in whether she was moving back to Coffee Creek, stepping past her as if she was nothing more than an inanimate obstacle. He made his way to the counter, where he pulled out his wallet. Heck and darn, but that man had a way about him. Cassidy glanced at the two women back to see if they felt it too. Sure enough, they both had their eyes on Coffee Creek's sexy vet. One of them pretended to fan her face with her hand. The other laughed and winked at Cassidy. Cassidy didn't wink back. He wasn't that good-looking. She gave him another glance, seeing his profile, long and muscular build. Okay, maybe he was that good-looking. Still, he probably hated her, and she had only herself to blame. Winnie set 2 coffees into 2 to-go cups and on the counter, then bagged them each one of their homemade cinnamon buns, baked every day fresh by their ex-bronc rider, Vince Butterfield, a veteran of the rodeo circuit and a member of the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Vince had licked a lifelong dependence on alcohol, and in his 60s had begun a new career as a baker. Page 22, 23, and here comes 24. His mother, old recipe for melt-in-your-mouth sticky buns, thickly topped with frosting, and his new claim to fame. 5 minutes ago, Cassidy had been craving one of them desperately. Now her stomach churned at that thought. What were the chances that she and Farley would happen into the same cafe at the same time? Pretty darn slim. So slim that, in fact, she hadn't run across him here since in the past 4 years. Other than at church last July, she hadn't seen him anywhere else, either. If he had called out to the ranch when she happened to be at home, she always made herself scarce. She avoided him at the funeral. If his name came up in conversation with her brother, she tried not to listen. And now here he stood, just a few feet away, making it very hard not to remember. But no, she would not think back to that night. She could not bear it. So where are you off to now, Farley? Laurel asked, her tone friendly. Everyone in the Coffee Creek area called the vet by his last name. probably to avoid confusion with his father, also named Dan, whom he worked with before the elder Farley and his wife retired to Arizona. Page 25. Farley glanced briefly at Cassidy again before answering. Coffee Creek Ranch. Though there were plenty of reasons why the vet might have been called out to her family's ranch, Cassidy first thought of what was for Sky. At 14 years of age, every day she was a blessing. What's wrong? Your mother's young Palomino is sick. Sounds serious. Lucky Lucy? Oh no, she was glad Sky was okay, but this news was just about as bad. Her mother had brought a beautiful 3-year-old Palomino just this year, and Cassidy loved her. Lucy had a wild heart but a gentle soul. Though she was her mother's horse, Cassidy had felt a special connection with the mare from the first time she ridden her. Any idea what the problem is? From the symptoms Jackson described, sounds like strangles. Really, in all of her 25 years, there had never been a case of strangles on the ranch. She didn't even know that much about it, other than it was a highly contagious, serious infection of the nose and lymph nodes. I'll have to examine the horse, run some tests to be sure. He added a generous amount of cream to his coffee, fitted the cup with a lid, then grabbed one of the bagged cinnamon buns. See you later, Laurel, and thanks. No word to Cassidy whose ranch he was heading for. She might as well be an empty bar stool for all the attention he paid to her. Wordless herself, she watched as a half a dozen long strides took him out the door. The cafe fell silent then, and Cassidy realized that Laurel was looking at her, eyebrows raised. What's up with you and the vet? Cassidy shifted Stephanie to the other arm. She planned on staying for a while to visit, but the bad news about the ranch had her suddenly anxious to get moving again. Why do you ask? Are you kidding? Sparks were flying here and there, and they weren't the good kind. Farley isn't the chattiest of people, but I've never seen him be downright rude before. And the way he all but ignored you, that was rude. Yes, it sure had been. I guess it figures he has his reasons. Cassidy went around the counter to deliver Stephanie back to her playpen. She didn't seem very happy about being set down until her mother wound up a musical mobile that had been affixed to the side of the playpen. How do you get any work done with such a cute distraction around? Cassidy bent over to give her niece one last kiss. It's taken some adjusting by me, and the staff, Eugenia and Dawn, have been great, and even Vince has taken a few turns at rocking Stephanie when she's being fussy. That I'd like to see. Vince was the epitome of tough, silent cowboy from another era. I know, isn't it amazing what baby brings out in a person? It sure is, though Farley hadn't seemed moved by the baby at all. Of course, if it hadn't happened to be there, he probably would have been much friendlier to Laurel and her daughter. Is there anything I can do to help you before I leave? We're fine, Laurel assured her. Eugenia's shift is starting in about half an hour. That'll give me a chance to take Stephanie upstairs, feed her, and put her down for a nap. She's a great sleeper. Thank goodness she gives me a couple free hours every afternoon. Sounds like a good system. Cassidy counted out the money for her order and picked up her drink and her pastry. Now that Farley was gone, her appetite was returning. I better get going. Page 26, 27, and 28. Wait 1 minute. You really not going to give me the scoop on you and Farley? Nope. Cassidy gave Laurel a warm hug. I'll be back for when I can have a longer visit in a few days. Or I may drop in on you and Corb at the ranch one evening. I'll look forward to it, but be warned, next time I see you, you better be ready to tell me what's going on with you and the vet. He's considered the most eligible bachelor in town, you know. Cassidy wasn't surprised. The guy had presence, and those eyes. The single women of Coffee Creek needn't worry, she assured Laurel. I'm not going to be any competition where Dan Farley is concerned. She was out the door before Laurel had time for a comeback. Not that it mattered. She was not going to tell Laurel about the history between her and Farley. She never told anyone, and she bet Farley hadn't either. Okay. Page 29, which starts us on Chapter 2. I'm going to see how far I got this marked. Okay. I've got it marked up to page 32, so... Yeah, I've got more pages marked than that, but for a first time out, I'll try to get us probably into half a book. We'll see. Dan Farley settled his coffee cup into the holder of his truck and then wolfed down the last cinnamon bun in 2 minutes flat. Sweet and spicy, just like Cassidy Lambert, that little witch. She was back in town. Judging from all the baggage in her truck, she was done with the school. Would she be staying in Coffee Creek or moving on? Corb had mentioned she was studying accounting and thinking of working in Billings, but that and her mother had plans. He didn't care how it panned out. The little minx was trouble, and he intended to keep his distance. Page 30. For the longest time, she'd been nothing but the cute younger sister of his best friend, B.J., Corb, and Brock. With no siblings of his own, he hadn't really minded that when she tried to tag along with him, but Brock was always looking for ways to get rid of her. He said she talked too much, which was true. He complained she tried to be the boss of them, she tried to boss them around. Also true. But she had redeeming characteristics, among them a soft yet courageous heart. So many times she'd come to him and her brothers expecting them to help a baby chick that had fallen from its nest, a fawn struggling with a lame leg, a farm cat with distemper, eyes weeping from disease, matted fur over her scrawny body. Brock and Corb would brush her off, but he always done what he could to save the animal. And then Cassie turned 21. The person who needed saving was himself. An incoming call prevented him from dredging up further unwanted memories. He pressed the button on the steering wheel to patch it through. Hello, Farley. It was Liz Moffat, his right-hand woman at the office. Besides being his receptionist, the 33-year-old mother of 4 also did a pretty good job of running his private life as well. I just had a call from Maddie Turner. I'm on my way to Coffee Creek Ranch right now. The Lamberts' place was only 15 miles from Silver Creek Ranch. Maddie Turner and Olive Lambert were sisters, though they hadn't spoken to one another in over 30 years. When you're finished there, could you swing by Maddie's place? One of her cows is having a difficult birth. I'll do that. Oh, and Amber wants to know about tonight, if you think you'll be able to make it in time for the movie. He wanted to say yes, but knew better. Tell her probably not. I still have to check out the Harrington's lame cow. Maybe things will go well at Maddie's, and you'll both be able to go to both. Liz had fixed him up with Amber and was lobbying hard for that relationship to work. Maybe, but he doubted it. Maddie Turner didn't have the head for business, but her older sister did, and she'd been struggling financially for the past 5 years. She wouldn't be asking for his help if the situation with her cow and unborn calf weren't dire. 30, 31, and here's 32. But first he had the situation at the Lamberts to deal with, and maybe another chance to see Cassidy. No, if she knew he was there, she'd avoid the barns the way she usually did. Page 40 is very short. Cassie didn't put it past her. Skye was a remarkable dog. When she was younger, she'd been as useful as an extra hand moving, herding cattle. Now she was too old to work, but she was smart as ever. Finally, Cassie stood, brushing the fine gravel from her knees. She could go on to the house and wait for the rest of them to join her, but she'd seen Farley at the cafe, and the world hadn't fallen apart. Besides, she was anxious to find out if Lucy was going to be okay. She gave the signal for Skye to follow. Come on, girl, let's head down to the barn and find out what's going on. Moving forward. Page 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53. I'm going to try to take us into, well, let me see here. Okay, I'm going to get us up to page 70, and then that's where we'll stop tonight. Page 47. Olive frowned at that. Corb wasn't deterred. A couple of weeks could see us through the worst of this, if we're lucky. He turned to Farley. What's involved exactly? Farley shook his head. Strangles is incredibly contagious. It can be passed on through indirect contact with buckets, feed, grass, fences, and especially water troughs. I don't see why our quarter horses should be under quarantine then, Olive said sharply. We feed, water, and pasture them entirely separately from riding horses. The infection can also be transmitted by flies. Jackson replied calmly. I have to wonder how Lucy caught this. I haven't heard of any other cases in the area. Have you brought any new horses onto the property lately? Farley placed the vial for testing into his black case, then went to the sink at the corner of the barn and washed his hands. Jackson shook his head no, and then glanced at Olive. Didn't I see you load Lucy in the trailer last week? That wasn't Lucy, Olive said shortly. I did buy some second-hand tack at the auction on the last weekend. Page 48-49. That could be your culprit. I hate to say it, but your whole tack room should be disinfected. You're going to need to stock up on chlorhexidine soap. We have some, Corb said, pointing to a gallon by the sink. You're going to need more, but I have a few gallons in my truck I can give you now. He turned to Cassidy. If you're in charge of containing this infection, we should sit down somewhere and talk. He looked as excited as if he'd just sentenced himself to an hour in the dentist chair. Cassidy felt the same way herself. After a semester of study, she hoped to spend more time of her break on the back of the horse, not cooped up in a barn with a bucket and a rag. You two might as well talk in the office. Olive waved next door to the tack room. I'll bring out some coffee and sandwiches. I know Corb and Jackson will be happy to get back to work. Over the moon with excitement, Corb teased. He gave Cassidy a tap on the shoulder. We'll catch up later today. Okay, come by and say hi to Laurel and Stephanie. I did drop in at the cafe for a visit on my way through town, but I'll still take you up on that offer. Better disinfect your arms and hands if you had any contact with Lucy, Farley warned as the two men and Olive left the barn. And your boots. I'll set up a boot dip right now. Cassidy found a plastic tub and set the tack room, mixed up a disinfecting solution, and then she set the tub by the door so that anyone leaving the barn would be able to disinfect their boots on the way out. Corb, Jackson, and her mother all made use of the new boot dip and headed off to their respective chores. And then it was just the two of them in the barn with a suddenly uncomfortable silence. For a second, Cassidy considered trying to clear the air between them, but how could she possibly do that? What she'd done had been inexcusable, even only she'd been 21 at the time. Instead, she headed for the office, trusting Farley to follow, which he did along with Skye. The border collie settled at her feet when she sat in the oak chair behind the desk. Farley took the upholstered chair opposite, dwarfing the thing with his tall, muscular frame. It took a lot of physical strength to be a large animal vet, and no one could doubt that Farley had that, but it was more than his size that she found intimidating right now. When Farley looked at you in the eyes, you could tell that he wasn't one to compromise or make allowances. Cassidy found paper and a pen, taking notes, then waited for her instructions as the silence stretched on. She forced herself to meet the vet's gaze. What can I do to help Lucy? Hot compresses on the swollen glands. The abscesses will probably rupture on their own in about a week, but if they don't, I'll need to lance them. Cassidy made a note. Hot compresses. Anything else? It is important that she keep eating and drinking to maintain her strength. You can try feeding her gruel. That might go down easier than her usual hay mixture, but the majority of effort should go into keeping the infection contained. She nodded, well aware of the risk. As well as keeping Lucy quarantined from the other horses, you'll need to clean and disinfect her water buckets, feed containers daily. Bedding should be burned, walls and fences scrubbed down. His gaze fell to her hands, which were smooth and pale, so many months of study. You up for all that? Guess I'll have to be. There's more. Any contaminated pasture areas should be rested for at least 4 weeks. You want those scrubbed down too? One corner of his mouth turned up slightly. Fortunately for you, ultraviolet lights from the sun has natural antibacterial qualities. Yeah, I'm feeling really lucky right now, as Lucy is, I'm sure. Once more, Farley seemed to struggle not to smile, and seeing that, she felt an ache for the easy friendship they once shared. Though friendship wasn't quite the right word. She had a crush on him dating back to the days when he and her brothers would hang out together. As a young girl, she followed them around the ranch until Brock ran out of patience and came up with some devious plan to get rid of her. Remember the time Corb and Brock lured me up to the hayloft in the old cattle barn and then pulled down the ladder and stranded me up there? This is page 50, 51, 52, and 53. Farley blinked. She disarmed him by bringing up a story from long ago, before the trouble between them. I do. How did you get down, by the way? One of the hired hands heard me yelling and came to my rescue. You were quite the tomboy back then, but I guess it's going to be accounting offices and city life for you now, huh? You say that like it's a bad thing. He shrugged. I'm not the only one who's surprised. This was true. Corb, BJ, and her mother all tried to talk her out of studying business when she first told them about her plans to go to college. She didn't know if they didn't think she was smart enough or what, but they hadn't been supportive. "You-hoo," her mother's voice rang out. A few seconds later, breezed in the door with a tray. "I don't mean to interrupt. Just want to bring you out some lunch." She brought out a carafe of coffee, mugs, and a plate of sandwiches. After setting the tray on the middle of the desk between them, she stood back and looked from Cassie to Farley with a smile of satisfaction. "Actually," Farley said, "we were just finishing up here." "Don't be in such a rush. You have to eat, don't you? Take your time. I'm sure you two have a lot of catching up to do." And with that, Olive left, making a point closing the door behind her. Olive didn't often make herself scarce, so Cassie couldn't help but be suspicious. Was it possible her mother was hoping she and Farley? No, it couldn't be. She risked a quick look at the vet's expression, trying to judge if he felt any weird vibes from her mother, too. "Olive seems to be in a good mood for a rancher who had just had her livestock quarantined," he commented, reaching for one of the ham and cheese triangles. "Yeah, she's up to something." She felt the hot color rising on her neck. "Matchmaking," Farley suggested. "Kind of looks that way, doesn't it?" "A little," he admitted. The light in his eyes grew darker and colder. "Guess you forgot to tell her that I'm the last man on earth you'd ever want to be with." Page 52, 53. Here comes 54, 55. It wasn't true. Farley wasn't the last man on earth she wanted to be with, but she had told him he was. One minute before leaving the dance, she'd gone to as his date, on the arm of another man. At least she tried to leave with another guy. Oddly enough, she couldn't remember the name of the other guy anymore, but she did recall that she'd been the one to ask him to dance, with Farley on the sidelines, silent and angry. They danced an entire set together before she convinced some other guy that he wanted to drive her home. They left the dance floor arm in arm, but Farley, in a voice that was not open to negotiation, had stepped in at that point. "You came to the dance with me, and I'm damn well seeing you home safely." The other guy had stepped aside hastily then, no doubt having assessed Farley's size and the girth of his biceps, and decided he liked the shape of his nose just fine, thank you very much. Cassidy had endured a 15-minute drive in Farley's truck, driving which time not a single word was spoken. When they pulled up to the ranch house, he'd been out of the truck so fast that he had heard her door open before she even located the lever to do it herself. With his arms crossed over his broad chest, he stood watching until she safely was inside her home. Only then had he driven away. And he pretty much never spoke to her since then. Did she blame him? No. Was she embarrassed for the way she acted? Hell yes. The truth was, she never should have accepted the invitation for the dance in the first place. But he caught her off guard in the Lonesome Spur bar on the night of her 21st birthday. 54, 55, and here comes 56. She'd been out having her first legal drink with a group of friends when he caught her eye and crossed the room. She'd been ridiculously excited. Farley was older, hot, and so handsome. And suddenly he had noticed her too. "Is it true?" he asked, her dark eyes smoldering as an emotion she'd never seen in them before. "Pretty Cassie Lambert is no longer jailbait?" "I stopped being jailbait a long time ago," she announced with a voice full of sass and vinegar. That didn't mean she was quaking inside. She assumed Farley was completely out of her league, but now he was finally seeing her as someone other than his friend's annoying little sister. He asked her to the harvest dance, being held in the community hall the next evening. She accepted, and then all it had taken was one dance in his arms, and she panicked. Simple as that. "Is it too late for me to apologize for my behavior that night? I was just a kid." "No." Farley placed a hand on the desk. "If you'd still been a kid, I wouldn't have gone near you." "I suppose that's true, but I was young. It wasn't the classiest move I've ever seen, Cass, but it was honest. You were always the one for knowing what you wanted." He paused then pointedly, "and what you didn't." She stared at him mutely. How could he talk as if he never knew her so well, when she herself had never quite figured out why she acted the way she did that night? She hadn't been then, and wasn't now, a man-crazy sort of woman who liked to go on lots of dates and play one guy off another. "I should get going. I've got a call to make before I head back to the office. You clear on how to handle the Strangles?" She nodded, not bothering to point out that he'd only eaten one of her mother's sandwiches. She guessed that her company wasn't conducive to a good appetite on his part. She might have been wrong to think about talking about that night would clear the air between them or ease her guilty conscience. If anything, she felt worse. It wasn't the classiest move I've ever seen, Cass. God, she felt about 4 inches high right now. Clumsily, she got to her feet, almost knocking over her mug of coffee. She moved out from behind the desk. 56, 57, 58. Farley's eyes stayed cool. I can see myself out. I know. She followed him anyway. But I just wanted to ask you about something else. What is it? You said I should watch the rest of the horses in case they get sick too, but what exactly should I be looking for? Glad you asked that. Farley opened the office door, waited for her to pass through, then exited himself. Don't wait until you see the usual nasal discharge or hear the horse coughing. If any of the other horses go off their feed or seem lack their usual energy, separate them from the rest of the herd immediately and give me a call. Okay, they both washed up in the sink again and used the boot dip before leaving the barn. Mid-afternoon sun had Cassidy wishing she had sunglasses she left behind in her truck. Squinting, she glanced at Farley, who was setting a quick pace toward his own vehicle. How long will they be under quarantine? Farley tossed his black case into the passenger side of his truck. He paused a moment to consider her question. If you're diligent with disinfecting, if Lucy recovers quickly, and if none of the other horses come down with it, I'd say about 3 weeks. That's a long time. Yeah, but it's better to contain this thing now before it spreads and becomes a bigger problem. He narrowed his eyes. Or were you not planning to stay in Coffee Creek that long? That depends on whether I get a job or not. You're excited about spending your life as a pencil pusher in a city high-rise? Why not? She countered, placing her hands on her hips and narrowing her gaze. You think swabbing mucus from a sick horse's nostril is so much better? Actually, I do. He reached for his hat, settling it on his head, before giving her a final parting nod. But I wouldn't expect you to understand why. Though the little girl who grew up on this ranch would get it. That's 58 and 59. Here comes 63 and 64. Dan Farley drove away from the Coffee Creek Ranch, feeling disappointed, unsettled, frustrated. He wasn't usually a man given to complicated emotions. What was it about Cassidy Lambert? After all these years, she ought to be nothing to him. But it didn't help that she shown such concern for the sick horse. He'd always been a sucker for his soft heart. And it helped even less when she still filled out her jeans in all the right places. Add in that beautiful blonde hair and those disarming green eyes. Hey, maybe that's what they're going to say about me someday in a book. She had beautiful blonde hair and disarming green eyes. Anyway, back to the book. Hell, any man could be excused for losing his head over a girl like Cassidy. But he didn't want to do it twice. To distract himself, he checked in with Liz. Just finished at the Lamberts on my way to Silver Creek. That took a while. Page 64. Liz was probably worried he wouldn't make the date with Amber. Why did all the women assume that the man wasn't happy unless he was suitably married? Yeah, I put out the place under quarantine. We'll have to run tests. I'm pretty sure about the result. Bad luck for them, Liz allowed. Good luck at Silver Creek. Hopefully things will go better there. Okay, good news here. Guess what page is next? 69 and 70. So here we go. Page 69. Cassidy, so she's home from college, is she? Maddie seemed to know a lot about her sister's family. He supposed he shouldn't be surprised since she never married herself or had children. The Lamberts were the closest relations, which only made the feud between the sisters much sadder. Only a few weeks, apparently. She's hoping to get a job from some accounting firm in Billings. Really, I can't imagine Olive letting her do that. I'm sure Olive has much say in that matter. Olive has much say in that matter. Maddie's lips tightened. Then you don't know my sister very well. She hasn't been able to keep BJ from the rodeo circuit, he pointed out. All the more reason she's going to fight like hell to keep her daughter close to home. You think Cassidy's no pushover. Tenacity, it was in her DNA. And growing up with all those brothers had only made her tougher and more resilient. You don't know Olive, Maddie repeated. Not as well as you do, obviously, he allowed, but my money's still on Cassidy. I'm just going to see if the next one's a short page. It's not. So we're going to stop At page 80 is where we'll pick up. That's the first part of the book review for Her Cowboy Dilemma. You'll want to stay tuned for the rest of the book review for sure. Next up, I am going to sing a song or two.